Welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. I know not who may read this entry, but I take pen and paper in order to preserve my unfathomable tale. Though it sits fresh in my mind, as though it happened yesterday, the years will take my memory, and like the shifting sands from whence I was delivered, all will be lost to time. There is, as the conjurers say, no deception about this tale. If you go into the heart of the great Indian desert, you shall come across not a village, but a town, where the dead who do not die, but may not live, have established their headquarters. In the beginning, it all arose from a slight attack of fever. My work necessitated my being in camp for some months, in a desolate sandy stretch of country, as everyone who has the misfortune to go there may know. My workers were neither more nor less exasperating than other work gangs, and my work demanded sufficient attention to keep me from moping, had I been inclined to an unmanly weakness. On the 23rd of December, 1884, I felt a little feverish. There was a full moon at the time, and in consequence, every dog near my tent was baying at it. The brutes assembled in twos and threes and drove me frantic. A few days previously, I had shot one loud-mouthed annoyance and suspended his carcass about 50 yards from my tent door to scare the others away. But his friends fell upon it, fought for, and ultimately devoured the body. And as it seemed to me, sang their hymns of thanksgiving afterwards with renewed energy. The lightheartedness which accompanies fever acts differently on different men. My irritation gave way after a short time to a fixed determination to slaughter one huge black and white beast, who had been the foremost in song and first in flight throughout the evening. Thanks to a shaking hand and a giddy head, I had already missed him twice with both barrels of my shotgun, when it struck me that my best plan would be to ride him down in the open and finish him off with a hog spear. Well, this of course was merely the semi-delirious notion of a fevered patient, but I remembered that it struck me at the time as being eminently practical and feasible. I therefore ordered my groom to saddle Pornick and bring him around quietly to the rear of my tent. When the pony was ready, I stood at his head, prepared to mount and dash out as soon as the dog should again lift his voice. Pornick, by the way, had not been out of his pickets for a couple of days. The night air was crisp and chilly, and I was armed with a pair of especially long and sharp hog spears. You will easily believe then that when he was let go, he went quickly. In one moment the tent was left far behind, and we were flying over smooth sandy soil at racing speed. In another we had passed the wretched dog, and I had almost forgotten why it was that I had taken the horse and hog spears. The delirium of fever and the excitement of rapid motion through the air must have taken away the remnants of my senses. I have a faint recollection of standing upright in my stirrups and of brandishing my hog spears at the great white moon that looked down so calmly on my mad gallop, and of shouting challenges to the camel thorn bushes as they whizzed past. Once or twice, I believe, I swayed forward on Pornick's neck and literally hung on by my spurs, as the marks the next morning showed. The wretched beast went forward like a thing possessed over what seemed to be a limitless expanse of moonlit sand. Next, I remember the ground rose suddenly in front of us, and as we topped the ascent, I saw the waters of the Sutlej River shining like a silver bar below. Then Pornick blundered heavily on his nose, and we rolled together down some unseen slope. I must have lost consciousness, for when I recovered, I was lying on my stomach in a heap of soft white sand, and the dawn was beginning to break dimly over the edge of the slope down which I had fallen. As the light grew stronger, I saw that I was at the bottom of a horseshoe-shaped crater of sand, opening on one side directly onto the shoals of the river. My fever had altogether left me, and with the exception of a slight dizziness in the head, I felt I had no effects from the fall. Pornick, who was standing a few yards away, was naturally a good deal exhausted and had not hurt himself, but his saddle had been twisted under his belly. It took me some time to put him to rights, and in the meantime, I had ample opportunities of observing the spot into which I had so foolishly dropped. Imagine, then, as I have said before, a horseshoe-shaped crater of sand with steeply graded sand walls about 35 feet high. This crater enclosed a level of ground about 50 yards long by 30 at its broadest part, with a crude well in the center. Around the bottom of the crater, about 3 feet from the level of the ground proper, ran a series of 83 semicircular, ovoid, square, and multilateral holes, all about 3 feet at the mouth. Each hole, on inspection, showed that it was carefully shored internally with driftwood and bamboo, and over the mouth a wooden dripboard projected like the peak of a jockey's cap, for about 2 feet. No sign of life was visible in these tunnels, but a most sickening stench pervaded the entire amphitheater, a stench fouler than any which my wanderings in Indian villages have introduced me to. Having remounted Pornick, who was as anxious as I to get back to camp, I rode round the base of the horseshoe to find some place whence an exit would be practicable. The inhabitants, whoever they might be, had not thought to put in an appearance, so I was left to my own devices. My first attempt to rush Pornick up the steep sandbank showed me that I had fallen into a trap, exactly on the same model as that which the antlion sets for its prey. At each step, the shifting sand poured down from above in tons and rattled on the drip boards of the holes like small shot. A couple of ineffectual charges sent us both rolling down to the bottom, half choked with the torrents of sand, and I was constrained to turn my attention to the river bank. Here, everything seemed easy enough. The sandhills ran down to the river's edge, it is true, but there were plenty of shoals and shallows across which I could gallop Pornick and find my way back to terra firma by turning sharply to the right or to the left. As I led Pornick over the sands, I was startled by the faint pop of a rifle across the river, and at the same moment a bullet dropped with a sharp whit close to Pornick's head. There was no mistaking the nature of the missile. A regulation Martin Henry. About 500 yards away, a country boat was anchored in midstream, and a jet of smoke drifting away from its bow in the still morning air showed me from whence the shot had come. The treacherous sand slope allowed no escape from a spot which I had visited most involuntarily, and a promenade on the riverfront was the signal for a bombardment from some insane native in a boat. I'm afraid that I lost my temper very much indeed. Another bullet reminded me that I had better save my breath, and I retreated hastily up the sands and back to the horseshoe, where I saw that noise of the rifle had drawn 65 human beings from the badger holes, which I had, up to that point, supposed to be unattended. I found myself in the midst of a crowd of spectators, about 40 men, 20 women, and one child, who could not have been more than 5 years old. They were all scantily clothed in the salmon-colored cloth which one associates with Hindu mendicants, and at first sight gave me the impression of a band of loathsome fanatics. The filth and repulsiveness of the assembly were beyond all description, and I shuddered to think what their life in the badger holes must be. Even in these days, I had been accustomed to a certain amount of civility from my inferiors, and on approaching the crowd naturally expected that there would be some recognition of my presence. As a matter of fact, there was, but it was by no means what I had looked for. The ragged crew actually laughed at me. Such laughter I hope I may never hear again. They cackled, yelled, whistled, and howled as I walked into their midst, some of them literally throwing themselves down on the ground in convulsions of unholy joy. In a moment, I had let go Pornick's head, and, irritated beyond expression at the morning's adventure, commenced to punching at those nearest me with all the force I could. The wretches dropped under my blows like ninepins, and the laughter gave place to wails for mercy, while those yet untouched clasped me around the knees, imploring me in all sorts of uncouth tongues to spare them. In the tumult, and just when I was feeling very much ashamed of myself for having thus easily given way to my temper, a thin, high voice murmured in English from behind my shoulder, and I spun around quickly and faced the speaker. It was Gunga Das, the telegraph master, trying to gain my attention. Gunga Das I had known for 4 years before as a Deccani Brahmin loaned by the Punjab government. He was in charge of a branch of the telegraph office there, and when I had last met him was a jovial, full-stomached, portly government servant with a marvelous capacity for making bad puns in English, a peculiarity which made me remember him long after I had forgotten his services to me in his official capacity. Now, however, the man was changed beyond all recognition. Caste mark, stomach, slated color continuations, and unctuous speech were all gone. I looked at a withered skeleton, turbanless and almost naked, with long matted hair and deep-set codfish eyes, but for a crescent-shaped scar on the left cheek, the result of an accident for which I was responsible. I should never have known him. But it was indeed Gunga Das, and for this I was thankful. An English-speaking native who might at least tell me the meaning of all that I had gone through on that day. The crowd retreated to some distance as I turned toward the miserable figure and ordered him to show me some method of escaping from the crater. He held a freshly plucked crow in his hand, and in reply to my question, climbed slowly on a platform of sand which ran in front of the holes, and commenced lighting a fire there in silence. Dried bents, sand poppies, and driftwood burned quickly, and I derived much consolation from the fact that he lit them with an ordinary sulfur match. When they were in a bright glow, and the crow was nearly cooked, Gunga Das began without a word of preamble. He told me that there are only 2 kinds of men, the alive and the dead, and that when you are dead, you are dead. But when you are alive, you live. Here the crow demanded his attention for an instant as it twirled before the fire in danger of being burned to a cinder. He said, "If you are thought to die at home, but are not dead, you do not go to the place to be cremated. You come here." The nature of the reeking village was made plain now, and all that I had known or read of the grotesque and horrible paled before the fact just communicated by the ex-Brahmin. 16 years ago, when I first landed in Bombay, I had been told by a wandering Armenian of the existence somewhere in India of a place to which such Hindus were conveyed and kept, and I recollect laughing heartily at what I was then pleased to consider a traveler's tale. Gunga Das, as he bent over the unclean bird, watched me curiously. He removed the crow solemnly from the wood spit, and as solemnly devoured it. Then he continued his story, which I give in his own words. In epidemic of the cholera, you are carried to be burned almost before you are dead. When you come to the riverside, the cold air perhaps makes you alive, and then, if you are only a little alive, mud is put in your nose and mouth, so you die. If you are rather more alive, more mud is put. But if you are too lively, they take you away. To here, I was too lively, and made protestations with anger against the indignities that they endeavored to press upon me. In those days, I was Brahmin and proud man. Now I'm a dead man, and eat crows and other things. Here he eyed the well-gnawed breastbone with the first sign of emotion that I had seen since we had met. They took me from my sheets when they saw that I was too lively, and I have been here ever since. 2.5 years. Once I was Brahmin and proud man, and now I eat crows and other things. I asked him if there were any other ways to get out of the pit. No, he replied, and told me that when they try, the sand takes them down. I told him that the riverfront is open and that it's worth the effort to dodge the bullets at night. I had already matured a rough plan of escape which a natural instinct of selfishness forbade me from sharing with Gunga Das. He, however, divined my unspoken thought almost as soon as it was formed, and to my intense astonishment, gave a long, low chuckle of derision. He said, "You will not make any escape that way, but you can try. I have tried. Once only." The sensation of nameless terror and abject fear which I had in vain attempted to strive against overcame me completely. My lack of food, combined with the violent natural agitation of the ride that had exhausted me, well, I truly believe that for a few minutes I acted as a madman. I hurled myself against the pitiless sand slope. I ran around the base of the crater, blaspheming and praying by turns. I crawled out among the sedges of the river and to the front, only to be driven back each time in an agony of nervous dread by the rifle bullets, which cut up the sand around me, for I dared not face the death of a mad dog among the hideous crowd, and finally fell, spent and raving, at the curb of the well. No one had taken the slightest notion of the exhibition, which makes me blush in embarrassment when I think of it now. 2 or 3 men trod on me, on my panting body as they drew water, but they were evidently used to this sort of thing and had no time to waste upon me. The situation was humiliating. Gunga Dass, indeed, when he had banked the embers of his fire with sand, was at some pains to throw half a cupful of fetid water over my head, an attention for which I could have fallen on my knees and thanked him. But he was laughing all the while in the same mirthless, wheezy key that greeted me on my first attempt to force the shoals. And so, in a semi-comatose condition, I lay until noon. Then, being only a man after all, I felt hungry, and intimated as much to Gunga Dass, whom I had begun to regard as my natural protector. Following the impulse of the outer world when dealing with natives, I put my hand into my pocket and drew out 4 coins. The absurdity of the gift struck me at once as I was about to replace the money. Gunga Dass, however, was of a different opinion. "Give me the money," he said, "all you have, or we will kill you." Saying this as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A Briton's first impulse, I believe, is to guard the contents of his pockets. But a moment's reflection convinced me of the futility of differing with the man who had in his power to make me comfortable, and with whose help it was possible that I might eventually escape from the crater. I gave him all the money in my possession, for I always kept small change when I'm in camp. Gunga Dass clutched the coins and hid them at once in his ragged loincloth, his expression changing to something diabolical as he looked around to assure himself that no one had observed us. "Now, I will give you something to eat," he said. What pleasure the possession of my money could have afforded him, I'm unable to say, but inasmuch as it did give him evident delight, I was not sorry that I had parted with it so readily, for I had no doubt that he would have killed me if I had refused. One does not protest against the vagaries of a den of wild beasts, and my companions were lower than any beasts. While I devoured what Gunga Dass had provided, a coarse bread and a cupful of foul well water, the people showed not the faintest sign of curiosity. I could even fancy that they despised me. At all events, they treated me with the most chilling indifference, and Gunga Dass was nearly as bad. I plied him with questions about the terrible village and received extremely unsatisfactory answers. So far as I could gather, it had been in existence from time immemorial. I concluded that it was at least a century old, and during that time, no one had ever been known to escape from it. I had to control myself here with both hands, lest the blind terror should lay hold of me a second time and drive me raving around the crater. Gunga Dass took a malicious pleasure in emphasizing this point, and in watching me wince. Nothing that I could do would induce him to tell me who the mysterious "they" were. "It is so ordered," he would reply, "and I do not yet know anyone who has disobeyed the orders." "Only wait until my servants find that I'm missing," I retorted, "and I promise you that this place will be cleared off the face of the earth, and I'll give you a lesson in civility too, my friend." Your servants would be torn into pieces before they came near this place. And besides, you are dead, my dear friend. It is not your fault, of course, but nonetheless, you are dead and buried. At irregular intervals, supplies of food, I was told, were dropped down from the land side into the amphitheater, and the inhabitants fought for them like wild beasts. When a man felt his death coming on, he retreated to his lair and died there. The body was sometimes dragged out of the hole and thrown on the sand or allowed to rot where it lay. The phrase, thrown on the sand, caught my attention, and I asked Gunga Das whether this sort of thing was not likely to breed a pestilence. That, said he with another of his wheezy chuckles. You may see for yourself subsequently, but you will have much time to make observations. Whereat, to his great delight, I winced once more. I asked, how do you live here from day to day? What do you do? The question elicited exactly the same answer as before. But as long as I was with him, I fancy he was happy. Here I was, a representative of the dominant race, helpless as a child and completely at the mercy of his native neighbors. In a deliberate, lazy way, he set himself to torture me as a schoolboy would devote a rapturous half-hour to watching the agonies of an impaled beetle, or as a ferret in a blind burrow might glue himself comfortably to the neck of a rabbit. The burden of his conversation was that there was no escape, of no kind whatever, and that I should stay here till I died, and was thrown onto the sand. I was powerless to protest or to answer, all my energies being devoted to a struggle against the inexplicable terror that threatened to overwhelm me again and again. I can compare the feelings to nothing except the struggles of a man against the overpowering nausea of the Channel Passage, only my agony was of the spirit and infinitely more terrible. As the day wore on, the inhabitants began to appear in full strength to catch the rays of the afternoon sun, which were now sloping in at the mouth of the crater. They assembled themselves in little knots and talked among themselves without even throwing a glance in my direction. At about 4 o'clock, as far as I could judge, Gunga Das rose and dived into his lair for a moment, emerging with a live crow in his hands. The wretched bird was in a most draggled and deplorable condition, but it seemed to be in no way afraid of its master. Advancing cautiously to the riverfront, Gunga Das stepped from a tussock to tussock until he reached a smooth patch of sand directly in the line of the boat's fire. The occupants of the boat took no notice. Well, here he stopped, and with a couple of dexterous turns of the wrist, pegged the bird on its back with outstretched wings. As was only natural, the crow began to shriek at once and beat the air with its claws. In a few seconds, the clamor had attracted the attention of a bevy of wild crows on a shoal a few hundred yards away, where they were discussing something that looked like a corpse. Half a dozen crows flew over at once to see what was going on, and also, as it proved, to attack the pinioned bird. Gunga Das, who had lain down on a tussock, motioned to me to be quiet, though I fancy this was a needless precaution. In a moment, and before I could see how it happened, a wild crow who had grappled with the shrieking and helpless bird was entangled in its claws, then swiftly disengaged by Gunga Das and pinned down beside its fellow prisoner. Curiosity, it seemed, overpowered the rest of the flock, and almost before Gunga Das and I had time to withdraw to the tussock, 2 more captives were struggling in the upturned claws of the decoys. And so, the chase, if I can give it so dignified a name, continued until Gunga Das had captured 7 crows. 5 of these he throttled at once, reserving the 2 for further operations for another day. I was a good deal impressed by this novel method of securing food, and complimented Gunga Das on his skill. It is nothing said he. "Tomorrow, you must do it for me. Well, you are stronger than I am." This calm assumption of superiority upset me, and I yelled that he was a thief, and what had I paid him for then? "Very well," was the unmoved reply. "Perhaps not tomorrow, nor the day after, nor subsequent to that, but in the end, and for many, many years, you will catch crows and eat crows, and you will thank your European God that you have crows to catch and eat." I could have cheerfully strangled him for this, with my bare hands, and watched the life leave his eyes, but judged it best, under the circumstances, to smother my resentment instead. An hour later, I was eating one of the crows, and as Gunga Das had said, thanking my God that I had crow to eat. Never as long as I live shall I forget that evening meal. The whole population were squatting on the hard sand platform opposite their dens, huddled over tiny fires of refuse and dried rushes. Death, having once laid his hand upon these wretches, seemed to stand aloof from them now, for most of our company were old men, bent, worn and twisted with years, and women, aged to all appearance, as the fates themselves. They sat together in knots and talked. God only knows what they found to discuss. Now and then, an excess of that sudden fury which had possessed me in the morning would lay a hold of a man or a woman, and with yells and the imprecations the sufferer would attack the steep slopes until, baffled and bleeding, they fell back on the platform, incapable of moving a limb. And the others would never even raise their eyes when this happened, as though wearied with their useless repetition. And I saw 4 such outbursts in the course of the evening. Gunga Das took an eminently businesslike view of my situation, and while we were dining, propounded the terms on which he would consent to aid me. My money would provide me with food for 51 days, or about 7 weeks. That is to say, he would be willing to cater for me for that length of time. At the end of it, I was to look after myself. For a further consideration of my boots, he would be willing to allow me to occupy the den next to his own, and would supply me with such dried grass for bedding as he could spare. "Very well, Gunga Das," I replied. "To the first term I cheerfully agree, but as there is nothing on earth to prevent my killing you as we sit here and taking everything that you have, I flatly refuse to give you my boots and shall take whichever den I please." Now, the stroke was a bold one, and I was glad when I saw that it had succeeded. Gunga Das changed his tone immediately, and disavowed all intention of asking me for my boots. At the time, it did not strike me at all as strange that I, a civil engineer, a man of 13 years standing in the service, and, I trust, an average Englishman, should thus calmly threaten murder and violence against the man who had, for consideration it is true, taken me under his wing. I had left the world, it seemed, for centuries. I was as certain then as I am now of my own existence, that in the accursed settlement there was no law save that of the strongest, that the living dead men had thrown behind them every cannon of the world which had cast them out, and that I had to depend for my own life on my strength and vigilance alone. I argued to myself I was strong and a match for 6 of those wretches. It is imperatively necessary, I thought to myself, that I should, for my own sake, keep both health and strength until the hour of my release comes, if it ever does. Fortified with these resolutions, I ate and drank as much as I could, and made Gunga Dass understand that I intended to be his master, and that the least sign of insubordination on his part would be visited with the only punishment I had in my power to inflict: sudden and violent death. Shortly after this, I went to bed. From my den, which faced the riverfront, I was able to watch the waters of the river flowing past under the lights of a young moon and compose myself to sleep as best I might. The horrors of the night I shall never forget. Oh, my den was nearly as narrow as a coffin, and the sides had been worn smooth and greasy by the contact of innumerable naked bodies, which added to its abominable smell. Sleep was altogether out of the question to one in my excited frame of mind. As the night wore on, it seemed that the entire amphitheater was filled with legions of unclean devils that, trooping up from the shoals below, mocked the unfortunates in their lairs. Personally, I'm not of an imaginative temperament, but on that occasion, I was completely prostrate with nervous terror. After half an hour or so, however, I was able to calmly review my chances of escape. Any exit by the steep sand walls was, of course, impracticable. I had been thoroughly convinced of this some time before. It was possible, just possible, that I might, in the uncertain moonlight, safely run the gauntlet of the fire from the rifle shots. The place was so full of terror for me that I was prepared to undergo any risk in leaving it. Imagine my delight, then, when after creeping stealthily to the riverfront, I found that the infernal boat was not there. My freedom lay before me in the next few steps. By walking out to the first shallow pool that lay at the front of the projecting left horn of the horseshoe, I could wade across, turn the flank of the crater, and make my way inland. Without a moment's hesitation, I marched briskly past the tussocks where Gunga Dass had snared the crows, and out in the direction of the smooth white sand beyond. My first step from the tufts of dried grass showed me how utterly futile was the hope of any escape. For as I put my foot down, I felt an indescribable drawing, a sucking motion of the sand below. In another moment, and my leg was swallowed up nearly to the knee. In the moonlight, the whole surface of the sand seemed to shake with devilish delight at my disappointment. And I struggled to clear, sweating with terror and exertion, back to the tussock behind me, and fell on my face. My only means of escape from the semicircle was protected with quicksand. How long I lay, I have not the faintest idea, but I was roused at last by the malevolent chuckle of Gunga Dass in my ear. I would advise you, protector of the poor, to return to your house. It is unhealthy to lie down here. Moreover, when the boat returns, you will almost certainly be shot at. He stood over me in the dim light of the dawn, chuckling and laughing to himself. Suppressing my first impulse to catch the man by the neck and throw him on the quicksand, I rose sullenly and followed him to the platform below the burrows. Suddenly, and futilely as I thought while I spoke, I asked, "What is the good of a boat if I can't get out anyhow?" I recollect that even in my deepest trouble I had been speculating vaguely on the waste of ammunition and guarding an already well-protected foreshore. Gunga Dass laughed again and made answer. "They have the boat only in daytime. It is for the reason that there is a way. I hope we shall have the pleasure of your company for a much longer time." It is a pleasant spot when you've been here some years and eaten roast crow long enough. I staggered, numb and helpless, toward the fetid burrow allotted to me and fell asleep. An hour or so later, I was awakened by a piercing scream, the shrill, high-pitched scream of a horse in pain. Those who have once heard that will never forget that sound. I found little difficulty in scrambling out of the burrow. When I was out in the open, I saw Pornick. My poor Pornick, lying dead on the sandy soil. How they had killed him, I cannot guess. Gunga Dass explained that the horse was better than Crow, and then offered me a share of my old friend. My Pornick. We were a republic of wild beasts, penned at the bottom of a pit, to eat and fight and sleep till we died. I attempted no protest of any kind, but sat down and stared at the hideous sight in front of me. In less time, almost less than it takes me to write or tell this story, Pornick's body was divided in some unclear way or other. The men and women had dragged the fragments onto the platform and were preparing their normal meal. Gunga Dass cooked mine. The almost irresistible impulse to fly at the sand walls until I was all worn out laid a hold of me, afresh, and I had to struggle against it with all my might. Gunga Dass was offensively jocular, till I told him that if he addressed another remark of any kind whatever to me, I should strangle him where he sat. Well, this silenced him till the silence became insupportable. Then I bade him say something. "You will live here till you die, like the other white man," he said, coolly, watching me over the fragment of gristle that he was gnawing. "What other man? And don't stop to tell me a lie." "Oh, he's over there," answered Gunga Dass, pointing to a burrow mouth about 4 doors to the left of my own. "You can see for yourself. He died in the burrows, as you will die, and I will die, and as all these men and women and that one child will also die. Tell me all you know about him. Who is he? What did he come? When did he die?" I loudly urged. This appeal was a weak step on my part. Gunga Dass only leered and replied, "I will not, unless you give me something first." Well, then I remembered where I was, and I struck the man between the eyes, partially stunning him. He stepped down from the platform at once, and cringing and fawning and weeping and attempting to embrace my feet, led me around to the burrow which he had indicated. "I know nothing whatever about the gentleman. Your God be my witness that I do not. He was as anxious to escape as you were. And he was shot from the boat, though we all tried to prevent him from attempting this. But he was shot. Right here." Gunga Dass laid his hand on his lean stomach and bowed to the earth. I told him to continue. "Well then, we carried him into his house and gave him water, and we put wet cloth on the ground, and he lay down in his house and gave up the ghost." I asked how long it took. "About half an hour after he received his wound. I called Vishnu to witness, and I did everything for him, everything which was possible. That I did." He threw himself down on the ground and clasped my ankles, but I had my doubts about Gunga Dass's benevolence and kicked him off as he lay protesting. "I believe you robbed him of everything he had, but I can find out in a minute or two." How long was he here? I asked. Nearly 1.5 years. I think he must have gone mad. But hear me, swear I never touched an article that belonged to him. What are you going to do? He screamed as I took him by the waist and hauled him onto the platform opposite the deserted burrow. As I did so, I thought of my wretched fellow prisoner's unspeakable misery amongst all these horrors for 18 months, and the final agony of dying like a rat in a hole, with a bullet wound in his stomach. Gunga Dass fancied I was going to kill him and howled pitifully. The rest of the population watched us, without even stirring. Go inside, Gunga Dass, said I. Bring him out. I was feeling sick and faint with horror now. Gunga Dass nearly rolled off the platform and howled aloud. But I am Brahmin, sir, a high caste Brahmin. By your soul, by your father's soul, do not make me do this thing. Brahmin or no Brahmin, my soul and my father's soul, you will go in and drag him out, I said, and seizing him by the shoulders, I crammed his head into the mouth of the burrow, kicked the rest of him in, and, sitting down, covered my face with my hands. And after a few moments, I heard a rustle and a creak. Then Gunga Dass in a sobbing, choking whisper speaking to himself, and then a soft thud, and I uncovered my eyes. The dry sand had turned the corpse, entrusted to its keeping, into a yellow-brown mummy. I told Gunga Dass to stand off while I examined it. The body, clad in an olive-green hunting suit, much stained and worn, with leather pads on the shoulders, was that of a man between 30 and 40, about middle height, with light sandy hair, a long mustache, and a rough, unkempt beard. The left canine of the upper jaw was missing, and a portion of the lobe of the right ear was gone. On the second finger of the left hand was a ring, a shield-shaped bloodstone set in gold with a monogram that might have been either BK or BL. On the third finger of the right hand was a silver ring in the shape of a coiled cobra, much worn and tarnished. Gunga Dass deposited a handful of belongings that he had picked up out of the burrow at my feet, and covering the face of the body with my handkerchief, I turned to examine these. I give the full list in the hope that it may lead to the identification of the unfortunate man. Bowl of a briarwood pipe, 2 patent lever keys, tortoiseshell-handled penknife, silver or nickel, nameplate marked with monogram BK, envelope, postmark undecipherable bearing a Victorian stamp, imitation crocodile skin notebook with pencil, 15 pages filled with private memoranda relating chiefly to 3 persons, a Mrs. L. Singleton, Mrs. S. May, and a Garmison, referred in places as Jerry or Jack, and a handle of a small-sized hunting knife. The notebook first attracted my attention, and I put it in my pocket with a view of studying it later on. The rest of the articles I conveyed to my burrow for safety's sake, and there, being a methodical man, I inventoried them. I then returned to the corpse and ordered Gunga Dass to help me carry it out to the riverfront. While we were engaged in this, the fired casing of an old brown cartridge dropped out of the pocket and rolled in my feet. Gunga Dass had not seen it, and I fell to thinking that a man does not carry a fired cartridge case with him when shooting, especially browns, which will not bear reloading twice. In other words, that cartridge case had been fired from inside the crater. Consequently, there must be a gun somewhere. I was on the verge of asking Gunga Das, but checked myself, knowing that he would lie. We laid the body down on the edge of the quicksand by the tussocks. It was my intention to push it out and let it be swallowed up, the only possible mode of burial that I could think of. At any rate, I ordered Gunga Das to go away. Then I gingerly put the corpse out onto the quicksand. In doing so, it was lying face down. I tore the frail and rotted khaki shooting coat open, disclosing a hideous cavity in the back. I've already told you that the dry sand had, as it were, mummified the body. A moment's glance showed that the gaping hole had been caused by a gunshot wound. The gun must have been fired with the muzzle almost touching the back. The shooting coat, being intact, had been drawn over the body after death, which must have been instantaneous. The secret of the poor wretch's death was plain to me in a flash. Someone in the crater, presumably Gunga Das, must have shot him with his own gun, the gun that fitted the brown cartridges. He had never attempted to escape in the face of the rifle fire from the boat. I pushed the corpse out hastily and saw it sink from sight, literally in a few seconds. I shuddered as I watched it. In a dazed, half-conscious way, I turned to peruse the notebook. A stained and discolored slip of paper that had been inserted between the binding and the back had dropped out as I opened the pages. And this is what it contained. 4 out from Crow Clump, 3 left, 9 out, 2 right, 3 back, 2 left, 14 out, 2 left, 7 out, 1 left, 9 back, 2 right, 6 back, 4 right, 7 back. The paper had been burned and charred at the edges. What it meant, I could not understand. I sat down on the dried bench, turning it over and over between my fingers until I was aware of Gunga Das standing immediately behind me with glowing eyes and outstretched hands. "Have you got it?" he panted. "Will you not let me look at it also? I swear I will return it." "Got what?" "Return what?" I asked. "That which you have in your hands. It will help us both." He stretched out his long bird-like talons, trembling with eagerness. "I could never find it," he continued. "He had secreted it about on his person, and therefore I shot him. But nevertheless, I was unable to obtain it." Gunga Das had quite forgotten his little fiction about the rifle bullet. I received the information perfectly calmly. Morality is blunted by consorting with the dead who are alive. I asked him what he wanted and what he was raving about. He continued on about the piece of paper I found and that it would help us escape. His voice rose almost to a scream, and he danced with excitement before me. I admit, I was moved at the chance of my getting away. I asked how the piece of paper would help and what it meant, and he pleaded with me to read it aloud, so I did. Gunga Das listened delightedly and drew an irregular line in the sand with his finger. "Ah, I see now. It was the length of his gun barrels, without the stock. I have those barrels. 4 gun barrels out from the place where I caught crows. Straight out, do you follow me? Then 3 left, and how well I remember when that man worked it out night after night. Then 9 out, and so on. Out is always straight before you cross the quicksand. He told me so. Before I killed him." But if you knew all this, why didn't you get out of here before? Well, I did not know. He told me that he was working it out 1.5 years ago, and how he was working it out night after night when the boat had gone away. And he could get out near the quicksand, safely. Then he said that we would get away together. But I was afraid that he would leave me behind on the night when he had worked it all out. So I shot him. Besides, it is not advisable that the men who once get in here should escape. Only I, and I a Brahmin, should escape. The prospect of escape had brought Gunga Das cast back to him. He stood up, walked about, and gesticulated violently. Eventually I managed to calm him, make him talk soberly, and he told me how this Englishman had spent 6 months, night after night, exploring, inch by inch, exploring the passage across the quicksand, how he declared it to be simplicity itself, up to within about 20 yards of the river bank after turning the flank of the left horn of the horseshoe. This much he had evidently not completed when Gunga Das shot him with his own gun. In my frenzy of delight at the possibilities of escape, I remember shaking hands most excitedly with Gunga Das after we had decided that we were to make an attempt to get away that very night. The anticipation was extremely wearing throughout the afternoon. About 10 o'clock, as far as I could judge, when the moon had ridden just above the lip of the crater, Gunga Das made a move for his burrow to bring out the gun barrels whereby to measure our path. All the other wretched inhabitants had retired to their lairs long ago. The Guardian boat had drifted downstream some hours before, and we were utterly alone by the crow clump. Gunga Das, while carrying the gun barrels, let slip the piece of paper which was to be our guide. I stooped down hastily to recover it, and as I did so, I was aware that the diabolical Brahmin was aiming a violent blow at the back of my head with the gun barrels. It was too late to turn around. I must have received the blow somewhere at the nape of my neck. 100,000 fiery stars danced before my eyes, and I fell forward senseless at the edge of the quicksand. When I recovered consciousness, the moon was going down, and I was sensible of intolerable pain in the back of my head. Gunga Das had disappeared, and my mouth was full of blood. I lay down again and prayed that I might die without more ado. Then the unreasoning fury which I had before mentioned laid a hold of me, and I staggered inland toward the walls of the crater. It seemed that someone was calling me in a whisper, exactly as my bearer used to call me in the morning. And I fancied that I was delirious until a handful of sand fell at my feet. And I looked up and saw a head peering down into the amphitheater, the head of Danu, my dog boy, who had attended my collies. As soon as he had attracted my attention, he held up his hand and showed a rope. I motioned, staggering to and fro for the while, that he should throw it down. It was a couple of leather puka ropes knotted together with a loop at the end. I slipped the loop over my head and under my arms. I heard Danu urge something forward. I was conscious that I was being dragged face downward up the steep sand slope, and the next instant found myself choked and half fainting on the sand hills overlooking the crater. Danu, with his face ashy gray in the moonlight, implored me not to stay but to get back to my tent at once. It seems that he had tracked Pornick's footprints 14 miles across the sands to the crater, had returned, and told my servants who flatly refused to meddle with anyone, white or black, once fallen into the hideous village of the dead. Danu had taken one of my ponies and a couple of puka ropes, returned to the crater, and hauled me out as I have described. To cut a long story short, Danu is now my personal servant on large monthly payments in gold, a sum which I still think far too little for his services that he has rendered. Nothing on earth will induce me to go near that devilish spot again, or to reveal its whereabouts more clearly than I have done. Of Gunga Das, I have never found a trace, nor do I wish to do so. My sole motive in giving this to be published is the hope that someone may possibly identify from the details in the inventory which I have given above the corpse of that poor forgotten man in the olive green hunting suit. If you like these stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.